Hey folks, so today we're going to discuss right speech. It's both the third aspect of the Eightfold Path, but also gives us a lot of lessons that we can learn from for how to behave properly in the world in ways that make the world a kinder place to live. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're interested in learning how to make the world a wiser, a kinder, and a less stress-filled place, consider subscribing. So right speech. Now there are classically sort of four different aspects to right speech, which we'll go through, but it's a little more complex than that as well, and I'll try to get into some of that in this today's talk. So the first one that I think is no surprise to any of us is that we should abstain from lying, right? So we shouldn't lie to people. Now each of these aspects has a negative and a positive aspect, so obviously the positive aspect of not lying is to tell the truth, to be a person of integrity, somebody you can be confident in, someone whose testimony or discussion is reliable so that you can rely on them to be truthful. And of course this is the one aspect where right speech is almost universal. I think every culture really has this as part of what they consider the ethics of speech. Another second aspect of right speech in Buddhism is to avoid divisive speech. That is to say, to speak in ways that create harmony between people. The third aspect, which is somewhat related, is to avoid abusive speech. That is to speak kindly, to speak politely with other people, to avoid nastiness as much as we can. A related aspect of this is that we should attempt to praise others when we can, that we should praise them easily, to praise other people's praiseworthy qualities easily without having to be pushed to do it. On the other hand, the Buddha recommends that when it comes to people's negative qualities, that we be reluctant to discuss them with other people unless pressed to do so. He also, however, recommends the opposite when it comes to ourselves. For example, what he would say is for yourself, you should be open about your own negative qualities, but be more reticent to discuss your positive ones. Now, I know that this goes against a certain sort of Western tendency, in particular American tendency, I think, to be self-promoters, to tend to be our own best cheerleaders. And I think we can all come to understand that that has, of course, it has certain positive aspects, but it has a lot of negative aspects as well, because to the extent that we become our own cheerleaders, we may become less reliable to other people as well. They sort of take it as puffery, right? That we're not really being serious when we're talking about ourselves in these ways, and it may even seem kind of crass. It can also sort of shade over into an unawareness of our own faults. I mean, it's one thing, of course, to understand your faults, but to try to minimize them perhaps when in conversation with other people. But it may end up that we get ourselves into a state of delusion about our own qualities, that we end up sort of believing our own PR, as it were. And the fourth aspect of right speech in Buddhism is to avoid what's called idle chatter, or gossip is another word for it. And the opposite of that is to try to speak meaningfully when we're with other people. I think we have to understand that that right speech, these kinds of recommendations, were provided to both monastics and lay people. And I think in particular, the injunction against idle chatter makes sense in a monastic context, in particular where you're talking about sort of professional people along the path. And he recommends that monastics spend their time when they're in conversation with other people talking about the Dharma. That's less clear, I think, within a lay context where one is not a professional person along the path, one has a profession in other ways, and where what may seem idle chatter to outsiders may not be in the particular context. So I think there are a number of questions that may come up for us when we hear about these kinds of recommendations for right speech. There's the famous example of what happens when the Nazi SS officer comes up and knocks at the door and asks us if we're hiding anybody inside. So do we lie to them and tell them there's nobody inside? Or do we tell them the truth that we're hiding somebody inside only to have the person therefore given up to almost certain death? And here it seems as though the injunction not to lie may seem a little bit overly harsh. In this case, it's important to understand that these notions of Buddhist ethics, and in particular of right speech, should be seen in a larger context. The Buddha's notion of ethics is a notion of skillful behavior. behavior in ways that makes the world a better place. In particular, I think the overall umbrella should be seen as one of kindness and compassion towards other people and other beings. Telling the truth is a virtuous thing to do in general. It's good for ourselves, it's good for others, it's good for our relations with people. And so as a general rule, we should avoid lying as much as possible. But that does not necessarily mean that lying is always improper. A more clear example of this kind of thing occurs with divisive or harsh speech. The Buddha says not to use divisive speech, not to use abusive speech or harsh speech. But on the other hand, sometimes it's critical to speak difficult truths. And in particular, we can see that in the political situation that we're in nowadays. You know, if there were literally a complete injunction against harsh speech, we would never be able to speak necessary truths to other people. And the Buddha here is really actually quite explicit. He says that let's say harsh speech, which might be frankly divisive in certain circumstances, is appropriate in the case that it's beneficial, okay? If it has a positive benefit. And he is aware that there are certain circumstances under which speaking harsh truths is beneficial. But in that case, we should be careful to engage in that kind of speech at the right time, in the right place. So for example, if somebody is behaving badly in an organization, it may not be the right time or place to confront that person harshly with harsh speech in a group. Okay, because that just embarrasses them, it embarrasses other people, it makes them immediately become defensive, and it's not a circumstance under which they're going to take any kind of recommendations to heart. On the other hand, perhaps there's a time when you can be alone with them and speak in a kind fashion what may be harsh truths. And in fact, what the Buddha says is that it might not only be disagreeable for them to hear the harsh truths, but it may be just as disagreeable to you to speak them. I think we all find these kinds of conversations difficult, and we may indeed avoid them for that very reason. But the Buddha says we should not avoid harsh speech in these kinds of contexts when they're going to be beneficial. And in a similar way, we may say what may seem idle chatter, as we've mentioned before, may be useful in certain circumstances. Sometimes important information about the world, about other people, is gotten across through what might seem like idle chatter or gossip. But I think at the very least, what the Buddha is recommending is that we pay attention to that. If what seems gossip or idle chatter is in fact useful or beneficial in a circumstance, then there's nothing really wrong with it. But we shouldn't engage in it when we realize that it has no purpose, it serves no purpose, and certainly not if it's the kind of backbiting, divisive speech which really doesn't help anything. We've been talking about speech right from ourselves out. There's also the question of how we receive speech from other people. And here, as we've discussed with the Alagadupama Sutta and other places, a sutta that discusses the Buddha's own kind of emotional response to speech, we should try to get ourselves to a place where we are not affected by the quality of speech that is directed at us, whether it's positive or negative. So just as we should not engage in harsh speech, if harsh speech is directed towards us, we should try to get ourselves to a place where we can let that pass without it affecting us, without it getting us upset. And similarly, we should get ourselves to a place where praise does not go to our heads. For sure, these are difficult practices. And I'm not in a place where I can say that I've gotten anywhere close to the end of that. But at least we can see the direction that we're heading in. So this is, in a nutshell, is the Buddha's recommendations about speech. But let me take it a step further here and talk about some lessons we can take from this in an interconnected world. You know, in the Buddha's day, it was only about speech, verbal speech. Then, of course, we have writing. For hundreds of years, writing was almost always the kind of thing that took a long time to get prepared before it was actually published. Okay, so it would go through a layer of editing. It would go through many readers often. It would take days, weeks, months for it to get to the stage where other people would be reading it. And all of these can be checks on our worst impulses towards speech towards one another. But nowadays, I think we all know, with the advent of the internet, with not only email, but instant messaging and Twitter and Facebook and so on, it often is that words come straight out of our minds, through our fingers and out to the world in an instant. A speech that might have been harsh towards one person is now broadcast to potentially thousands of people without much reflection. And this is why I think that these particular lessons on right speech are very, very important nowadays. That right speech isn't only an issue of telling the truth. It's at least that, but it's not only that. It's also something that we should keep in mind to, as much as possible, avoid speech that's divisive, that's harsh, that's nasty. It means perhaps taking a step back from a lot of online conversation. At the very least, allowing ourselves a few deep breaths, making maybe a step back literally from the internet before we respond to things. And it means also, I think, being aware of the aspect of online community that is idle chatter, that has no real purpose in our lives, that maybe could be substituted for something that's more meaningful. So I think in these ways we can see that these early recommendations from the Buddha on right speech can indeed help us to live a wiser life, a life that's less harmful to other people, a kinder life, a life that is less divisive, a life that is less harsh with other people, that's perhaps more communitarian in many ways. And also, because of all this and through all this, a life that's less stressful to us. Because insofar as we're putting out less that's divisive and harsh and nasty, we'll get less of that in return. No guarantees, but I think in general this is true. And if we get less of it in return, we'll be less stressed out about our online conversations. I mean, I know this has happened with me. Many years ago, I was much more interested in mixing it up in online communities, getting into arguments, and I found that it was very, very stressful for me. And the more that I would do meditation and become aware of the state of my own mind, the more I realized that it was really painful for me oftentimes for days. Days after things would happen on the internet, I would be quite emotionally disturbed in many ways about it. And I think by putting some of that aside and being able to separate what's really important from the idle chatter and the empty nastiness that much of internet conversation passes for, that we can actually lead, I think, better and more fulfilled lives. So I hope this has been useful to you. If you're new to the channel, welcome, and I hope you'll consider subscribing. We have talks like these roughly once a week on Mondays. So once again, thanks so much for being here, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks a lot.